The air in the exclusive Aurelia restaurant was thick with the scent of money and truffle oil, a place where whispers were worth more than shouts. But tonight, that would change. Gideon Shaw, a man whose name could move markets and shatter competitors, was about to unleash a storm. His voice, usually a low rumble of command in boardrooms, was a thunderclap that silenced the clinking of silverware. He was screaming at a young waitress over a single drop of spilled water. But what happened next wasn't in his script. The waitress, Taylor, looked him dead in the eye, her voice barely a whisper yet loud enough to crack the foundation of his world, and delivered a single sentence that would turn a billionaire into a beggar for answers. Aurelia wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theater. Perched on the 65th floor of a gleaming Manhattan skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows presented New York City as a glittering carpet of diamonds laid at the feet of its patrons. The staff moved with the choreographed precision of a ballet company, their faces masks of serene professionalism. For Taylor Petrova, it was both a lifeline and a cage. The tips paid for her tiny Brooklyn apartment and her night school textbooks. But the cost was her spirit, chipped away one condescending glance at a time. She was good at her job. More than good, she was invisible. She could anticipate the need for a water refill from a subtle gesture, clear a plate with the silence of a passing shadow, and smile placidly while a diner complained that the $500 bottle of Chateau Margaux was a bit presumptuous. Invisibility was survival. Tonight, however, survival felt a long way off. Table 7 was occupied by Gideon Shaw. Even before he arrived, a palpable tension had rippled through the staff. Mr. Dubois, the fastidious manager with a perpetually pained expression, had briefed them twice. "Mr. Shaw values precision above all else," he'd hissed. "No mistakes, not a single one." Gideon Shaw was a legend, a titan of industry forged in the brutal furnaces of corporate takeovers. He was a self-made man who had clawed his way from a forgotten borough to the pinnacle of global finance. His face, etched with the harsh lines of sleepless nights and ruthless decisions, was a regular feature on the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He was known for his Midas touch in business and his scorched earth approach to everything else. He did not suffer fools, and his definition of a fool was anyone who wasn't him. He sat alone, a solitary king surveying his kingdom below. His suit was a custom-tailored masterpiece of dark charcoal wool that probably cost more than Taylor's tuition. A Patek Philippe gleamed on his wrist as he gestured impatiently. Taylor approached, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. "The steak, it's medium rare," he stated, his voice a low growl. "I requested it on the rarer side of medium rare. There's a difference." Taylor's training kicked in. "My sincerest apologies, Mr. Shaw. I will have the chef prepare another for you immediately." "Don't bother," he waved a dismissive hand. "The moment is lost. The synergy of the meal is ruined." He took a sip of his wine, his eyes scanning the room with profound boredom, as if her very existence was an irritating gnat buzzing at the edge of his perception. Taylor retreated, shaken but intact. The rest of the service for his table proceeded with agonizing slowness. Every move she made was under his cold, analytical gaze. When she refilled his water glass, her hand, slick with nervous sweat, trembled almost imperceptibly. A single, minuscule drop of condensation escaped the chilled crystal glass and landed on the pristine, white linen, less than a centimeter from the base. It was nothing, a molecule of moisture. In any other circumstance, it would have evaporated unnoticed. But Gideon Shaw noticed everything. His eyes snapped from the city view to the tablecloth. He stared at the tiny dark spot as if it were a mortal wound. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. "What?" he said, the word dangerously soft. "Is that?" Taylor's blood ran cold. I apologize, sir. A drop of water. It was a mistake." He leaned back, a predator savoring the fear of its prey. A slow, cruel smile touched his lips. "A mistake? You call this a mistake?" He gestured to the drop of water with a flick of his fingers. "This isn't a mistake. This is an insult. This is a symptom of a disease. It's incompetence. It's the kind of lazy, thoughtless sloppiness that I have spent my entire life eradicating." His voice began to rise, shedding its boardroom restraint and taking on a raw, furious edge. Diners at nearby tables fell silent, their forks hovering over their plates. Mr. Dubois began to glide over, his face ashen. "Do you have any idea what it takes to sit at this table?" Gideon Shaw boomed, his voice now echoing in the cavernous room. "It takes vision. It takes sacrifice. It takes a relentless, soul-crushing pursuit of perfection. I built an empire from dust because I don't tolerate mistakes. I don't tolerate oops. I don't tolerate people like you." He pointed a finger at her, his hand shaking with rage. Taylor felt the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her. She was no longer invisible. She was the centerpiece of a public execution. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. Tears welled, hot and sharp, but she fought them back. "You walk in here," he continued, his voice dripping with contempt, "with your empty smile and your feigned deference, collecting your tips to pay for your worthless little life, and you dare to bring your pathetic mediocrity to my table? You are a nobody, a footnote. Your greatest ambition is to correctly pour water, and you can't even manage that." He was a hurricane of fury, and she was the flimsy shack in its path. Her mind screamed at her to run, to apologize, to grovel. But then something inside her snapped. It wasn't courage, not yet. It was the raw, primal instinct of a cornered animal. All the years of biting her tongue, of swallowing insults, of smiling through the contempt of the wealthy and powerful, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. He saw her as a nobody, an object. He had no idea who he was talking to. Gideon Shaw stood up, his full height casting a shadow over her. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and crumpled it in his fist. "Here," he spat, throwing the balled-up bill onto the table, "for the cleaning bill. Now get out of my sight before I buy this entire building and have it torn down with you inside." The room was utterly silent. Mr. Dubois was frozen a few feet away, his mouth agape. Taylor stood her ground. The tears had vanished. Her face was pale, but her eyes, a deep, stormy gray, were fixed on his. She didn't look at the money. She didn't look at the manager. She looked only at the monster in the $1,000 suit. She took a slow, deliberate breath. The air crackled. Her voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a clear, steady note that cut through the silence, like a shard of glass. "Did you ever find the locket you gave her, Mr. Shaw?" she asked. "The one with the swan?" The world stopped. For Gideon Shaw, a man who moved at the speed of light, who processed gigabytes of financial data before breakfast, time itself seemed to fracture and freeze. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the hum of the ventilation, the very pulse of the city outside the glass. All of it dissolved into a deafening, ringing silence. The locket, the one with the swan. It wasn't a question. It was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 25 years. A lock on a room in his soul he had bricked over, plastered, and pretended didn't exist. His rage, a towering inferno just seconds before, was snuffed out as if by a vacuum. In its place, a frigid wave of disbelief and confusion washed over him. His face, which had been a mask of crimson fury, went slack, the blood draining from it, leaving behind a waxy pale canvas of shock. His jaw, which had been set in a line of brutal authority, hung slightly open. How? The question hammered against the inside of his skull. How could she possibly know? That locket was not a piece of jewelry. It was a relic, a silver oval, intricately carved with a swan, its neck gracefully curved. Inside, there was supposed to be a tiny, folded-up photograph. He had given it to Katya on a rain-slicked pier in Brighton Beach a lifetime ago. It was a cheap, silly thing he'd bought from a street vendor, but it was all he could afford. It was the only time in his life he had ever given a gift with no agenda, no expectation of return. It was the only purely honest thing he had ever done. He lost her, and the locket was lost with her. No one knew about it. No one. Not his lawyers, not his ex-wives, not his closest confidants. It was a secret buried under decades of ambition and success, a ghost he had long since convinced himself was just a bad dream. And this waitress, this girl he had just verbally eviscerated, had summoned that ghost with a single sentence. The other diners stared, their curiosity a palpable force. They had witnessed the billionaire's tantrum, a satisfying bit of dinner theater. But this was different. The power dynamic had inverted so suddenly and so completely that it felt like watching gravity reverse. The waitress hadn't flinched. She hadn't cried. She had fired a single, perfectly aimed arrow that had pierced the Titan's armor. Mr. Dubois finally regained motor function. He scurried forward, his face a mess of panic and confusion. "Miss Petrova, that is enough," he hissed, grabbing Taylor's arm. "You are fired. Leave the premises immediately. Mr. Shaw, on behalf of Aurelia, I offer our most profound apologies for this unacceptable behavior." Gideon didn't even hear him. His eyes were locked on Taylor's. They were gray, he realized, just like Katya's. A deep, soulful gray that could look like a stormy sea one moment and a soft morning mist the next. It was a coincidence. It had to be. "Let her go," Gideon said. His voice was a hoarse, unfamiliar croak. Dubois froze, his hand still on Taylor's arm. "Sir?" "I said," Gideon repeated, his voice gaining a sliver of its old authority, but laced with a new, raw urgency. "Let her go. And you," he turned his gaze back to the manager, "disappear." The manager, utterly bewildered, looked from the stone-faced billionaire to the strangely calm waitress. He stammered, "But sir, she—" "Now!" Gideon roared, and this time the thunder was back, but it was a sound of desperation, not dominance. Mr. Dubois practically vaporized, scurrying back toward the safety of the maitre d's station. Gideon Shaw and Taylor Petrova stood alone in a bubble of silence, the rest of the restaurant a blurred, out-of-focus backdrop. He took a step closer, his mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Was this a shakedown? A setup? Had a competitor hired her to dig up dirt on him? It had to be something like that. It was the only thing that made sense in his world. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and intense. "Who sent you? How much do they want?" Taylor didn't answer the question. She simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable. There was no fear in her eyes anymore. There was something else. Pity, perhaps? Or maybe just a profound, weary sadness. "This is not the place," she said softly. The chaos in Gideon's mind was absolute. He needed answers. He needed them more than he had ever needed a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. The foundations of his carefully constructed reality were cracking. The past he had so meticulously buried was threatening to erupt into the present. He looked around the room at the gawking faces, the patrons whispering behind their hands. He had built his reputation on being an impenetrable fortress. In the span of 2 minutes, this girl had torn down the walls and exposed him to the world. "My office," he commanded, his mind seizing on the need for control, for a familiar environment. "Tomorrow, 9 o'clock sharp." Taylor shook her head slowly. "No." The refusal stunned him more than the initial question. No one said no to Gideon Shaw. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, no," she repeated, her voice even. "I won't be coming to your office. I'm not one of your employees you can summon, Mr. Shaw. You made that perfectly clear. If you want to talk, it will be on my terms." She reached into her apron, pulled out a small notepad and a pen, and scribbled down an address. She tore the page off and held it out to him. Her hand was perfectly steady. "My apartment, tomorrow, 6 o'clock in the evening. Come alone." Gideon stared at the small piece of paper as if it were a venomous snake. Going to some unknown apartment in Brooklyn? It was a security risk. It was beneath him. It was a complete surrender of control. He had no choice. His hand, the one that signed deals worth nations, trembled slightly as he took the paper from her. Their fingers brushed. He felt a strange jolt, a flicker of something ancient and elemental that he couldn't name. Without another word, Taylor turned. She unfastened her black apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on an empty chair at a nearby table. She walked past the stunned Mr. Dubois, past the silent, staring diners, and out of the gilded cage of Aurelia, leaving Gideon Shaw standing alone in the wreckage of his own making, clutching a crumpled $100 bill in one hand and a slip of paper that held the key to his entire life in the other. The next 24 hours were a private hell for Gideon Shaw. He didn't sleep. He sat in his penthouse, a sterile glass box overlooking the city he owned, and replayed the scene in his mind 1,000 times. The girl's eyes, the question, the one with the swan. He canceled all his meetings. His assistant, a sharp young man named Bennett, was met with a curt "handle it" for every crisis, every query. Gideon Shaw, the man whose schedule was planned to the minute 6 months in advance, had become a ghost in his own life, haunted by another. He tried to rationalize it. He ran through every scenario. Corporate espionage was the most likely. A rival, perhaps from the Henderson Group acquisition, had hired a private investigator who had unearthed the story of Katya Petrova. They'd coached this waitress, planted her at Aurelia, and engineered the confrontation to psychologically destabilize him before a major deal. It was a brilliant, vicious move. He could almost admire the sheer audacity of it. But the theory felt hollow. There was a sincerity in the girl's, in Taylor's eyes, that his world of cynical transactions couldn't account for. And there was that flicker of recognition, the echo of Katya in her gaze that he couldn't shake. As dust settled, casting long, dramatic shadows across the city, Gideon found himself in the back of his chauffeured Maybach, stripped of his usual security detail, heading toward an address in a part of Brooklyn he hadn't set foot in since he was a desperate young man with nothing but ambition. The building was a pre-war brownstone, tired but dignified. There was no doorman. The brass on the front door was tarnished. He buzzed the apartment, and a disembodied voice simply said, "Fourth floor," before the lock clicked open. The climb up the narrow, winding staircase felt like a descent. With each step, the plush carpets and climate-controlled air of his world receded, replaced by the scent of dust, old wood, and the faint aroma of someone cooking garlic down the hall. He was shedding the skin of Gideon Shaw, the Titan, and becoming Gideon, the man. It was a terrifying transformation. The door to apartment 4B was ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment was small, meticulously clean, but filled with the gentle clutter of a life lived, not just owned. Books were stacked on every available surface, not expensive coffee table ornaments, but well-worn paperbacks with cracked spines. A half-finished painting of the Brooklyn Bridge sat on an easel by the window. The furniture was old and mismatched but comfortable. It was a home. It was real. Taylor was standing by the window, looking out at the street below. She wore simple jeans and a gray sweater, her hair tied back. She didn't look like a waitress or a corporate spy. She looked like a young woman. "You came," she said without turning around. "You gave me no choice," he replied, his voice raspy. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, feeling like a bull in a china shop. "Let's get this over with. Who are you working for? What do you want? Name your price." Taylor finally turned to face him. The pity he'd glimpsed last night was back in her eyes. "You really see the whole world as a transaction, don't you?" she said, her voice soft but laced with an edge of disappointment. "This isn't about money." She gestured to a small, worn armchair. "Please, sit." He remained standing, crossing his arms. "I prefer to stand." It was a pathetic attempt to retain some semblance of control. Taylor sighed and walked over to a small wooden chest on a bookshelf. She opened it and took out a small, tarnished silver object. She held it in the palm of her hand. It was the locket. The sight of it punched the air from Gideon's lungs. It was real. He would have recognized the unique carving of the swan's wing anywhere. He took an involuntary step forward, his eyes fixed on the object that had haunted his dreams for a quarter of a century. "My mother kept this her entire life," Taylor said, her voice thick with emotion. "She told me the story 100 times, about a fierce, ambitious young man she met one summer. A man who dreamed of conquering the world, who promised to come back for her once he'd built his kingdom." Gideon felt his knees weaken. He sank into the armchair she had offered. The corporate espionage theory evaporated into smoke. This was real. This was his past, sitting in a stranger's apartment. "Her name," he whispered, the name feeling alien on his tongue after so long, "was Katya." "Katya Petrova," Taylor affirmed. She walked over and placed the locket on the small table beside him. "She waited for you. For years, she checked the post every day. She read the business papers, following your rise. Look," she'd tell me, "he's doing it. He's building his kingdom. Gideon stared at the locket, his mind a maelstrom of memories. Katya, her laughter like wind chimes, the way she'd steal food from his plate, the fierce belief she'd had in him when no one else did, when he was just a rough kid with impossible dreams. He had loved her. In his own selfish, immature way, he had. But ambition was a jealous god. He'd moved to the city, made his first million, then his first 10. The world opened up to him, and the distance between his new life and the simple girl from Brighton Beach grew from miles to light years. He'd told himself she'd be better off without him. He'd told himself he'd go back one day, but one day never came. Why didn't she contact me? He asked, the question laced with an anguish he didn't know he was capable of feeling. When I became successful, she could have found me. I would have. Would have what? Taylor interrupted, her voice sharp. Written her a check? Sent her on her way? She wasn't a problem to be solved, Mr. Shaw. She was a person, and she had her pride. You made your choice. You chose the kingdom over the queen. She understood that, but she never stopped loving you. A sickening realization began to dawn on Gideon, an inescapable truth contained within Taylor's words. She'd tell me. He looked up from the locket, his eyes locking with Taylor's gray ones. The resemblance was suddenly so clear, so painfully obvious, that he couldn't believe he hadn't seen it before. The shape of her face, the stubborn set of her jaw. It was Katya, softened and refined, but unmistakably her. His carefully constructed world, already fractured, shattered into a million pieces. She died 4 years ago, Taylor said, her voice breaking slightly. Cancer. It was quick. Before she passed, she gave me the locket, and she made me promise something. She made me promise that I would never seek you out for your money. She wanted me to make my own way, to be proud like her. So why? Gideon choked out, his throat tight. Why now? Why at the restaurant? Because I didn't seek you out, Taylor said, and now the anger she had suppressed for so long began to surface. Fate, God, or whatever you want to call it, sat you at my table. I've been working at Aurelia for 2 years. I've seen you there before, from a distance. I've always honored her wish. I've stayed away. But last night you looked at me with such hatred. You called me a nobody, a worthless little life. Tears began to stream down her face, hot and silent. You weren't just yelling at a waitress, Mr. Shaw. You were yelling at your own daughter. You were yelling at Katya's daughter. And I couldn't let you do that. Her memory, my life, it's not worthless. And I thought, for her sake, you deserved to know the truth of the world you abandoned. Daughter. The word detonated in the silent room. Gideon Shaw, the man who had everything, the man whose only legacy was a portfolio of stocks and a string of bitter divorces, had a daughter. A daughter he had never known. A daughter whose existence was living proof of his greatest failure. A daughter he had just humiliated in front of the entire world. He felt nothing. And then he felt everything. A quarter-century of buried grief, guilt, and regret erupted like a volcano. And for the first time since he was a child, Gideon Shaw began to weep. Not quiet, dignified tears, but wrenching, soul-shattering sobs of a man completely and utterly broken. The days that followed were a blur of disorientation for Gideon. The world he had commanded with absolute certainty now felt alien and unstable. The numbers on his trading screens, once the bedrock of his reality, seemed like meaningless symbols. He operated on autopilot, his mind perpetually replaying the conversation in that small Brooklyn apartment. His confession of tears had been a moment of raw, shocking vulnerability. Taylor had simply stood there watching him, her anger seemingly washed away by the pathetic sight of his collapse. She hadn't offered comfort. She had just given him a glass of water and said, "I think you should go now." And he had gone, stumbling out into the night like a man who had seen a ghost. But Gideon Shaw hadn't built his empire on emotion. He had built it on data, on verification, on ruthless, undeniable fact. As the initial shock subsided, the ingrained skepticism that had made him a billionaire began to reassert itself. A locket, a story, a resemblance. It was compelling, yes, but it wasn't proof. His mind, desperate to find solid ground, latched onto the need for certainty. He summoned Bennett to his penthouse. The young assistant arrived, impeccably dressed and carrying a tablet loaded with the day's crises, only to find his boss looking like a shipwreck survivor. Gideon was unshaven, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was still wearing the clothes from the night before. "Cancel my trip to Zurich," Gideon said, his voice a low rasp. "Clear my schedule for the foreseeable future. I have a new project for you. Top priority, absolute discretion. No one else is to be involved. Is that understood?" "Of course, Mr. Shaw," Bennett replied, his professional calm betraying none of his surprise. "I want you to find out everything there is to know about a woman named Katya Petrova," Gideon began, pacing the vast expanse of his living room. "Lived in or around Brighton Beach. She would be around 52 today. She died approximately 4 years ago. I want hospital records, death certificates, old addresses, work history, everything. And I want to know everything about her daughter, Taylor Petrova. Age, education, financials, social security number. I want to know what she had for breakfast this morning. I want irrefutable proof of paternity." Bennett listened, his expression unchanging, though inside he was reeling. This was a radical departure from the usual tasks of hostile takeovers and market analysis. This was deeply personal. "And Bennett," Gideon added, stopping to fix him with a haunted stare, "do it quietly. No PIs kicking down doors. Use our data mining resources. Back channels. Be a ghost." "I understand, sir," Bennett said. "I'll get right on it." For the next 72 hours, Bennett mobilized the full terrifying power of Gideon Shaw's information network. It was the same arsenal of digital tools and human assets they used for corporate due diligence. But this time it was aimed not at a rival company's balance sheet, but at the quiet, unassuming life of a waitress and her deceased mother. Encrypted databases were cross-referenced, public records were unearthed from dusty municipal archives, digital footprints were traced. It was a sterile, forensic dissection of a life, and with every file that appeared on Bennett's secure server, the story Taylor told was corroborated. He found Koch's employment records, a string of jobs as a seamstress, a baker's assistant, a home health aide. He found her medical files, detailing her short, brutal fight with pancreatic cancer. He found a digitized copy of her last will and testament, a simple document leaving her few possessions. A small wooden chest, my collection of books, and my silver swan locket, to her beloved daughter Taylor. Then he found the Holy Grail. Buried in the digital archives of a Brooklyn hospital was a birth certificate for one Taylor Petrova. Mother, Katya Petrova. Father, unknown. But the date of birth was March 12th, exactly 9 months after that summer Gideon had spent with Katya. The final piece of the puzzle, however, was what sealed it. Bennett's deep web crawlers, searching for any mention of Katya's name, flagged a hit on a long-defunct university forum from the early 2000s. It was a post from Katya herself for a creative writing class. She had posted a short, non-fiction piece. It was titled "The Swan and the Wolf." Bennett printed it out. It was a beautifully written, heartbreakingly sad story about a young girl who falls in love with an ambitious, hungry young man who devoured the world with his eyes and promised to build her a palace. He gives her a silver swan locket as a promise to return, but the wolf goes off to the forest to become king and forgets the swan waiting by the shore. The story ended with the swan, now older, looking at her own little signet and telling her that while the wolf may be king of the forest, they had the entire ocean to themselves. It was all there. It wasn't just proof, it was a confession, a love letter and a eulogy written 15 years after the fact. Bennett compiled everything into a single encrypted file, tabbed and indexed with cold efficiency. He walked into Gideon's office, placed a tablet on the massive mahogany desk, and said, "The report you requested, sir." Gideon looked at him, his face a mask of dread. "Just tell me," he said. "Is it true?" Bennett hesitated for a fraction of a second, the professional wall between them momentarily thinning. "Every piece of evidence we have found supports her claim," he said, his voice neutral. He paused, then added, "The birth certificate is in tab C. In tab G, you will find a short story written by Katya Petrova a number of years ago. I would recommend you start there." Gideon nodded numbly and gestured for Bennett to leave. Alone in the silence of his office, with the city sprawled beneath him, he opened the file. He didn't look at the birth certificate or the medical records. He opened tab G and began to read The Swan and the Wolf. He read it once, then a second time, then a third. The clinical corporate language he was used to was replaced by Katya's elegant, poignant prose. Each word was a memory, each sentence a fresh stab of guilt. He wasn't just a character in a story. He was the villain, the wolf who had abandoned the swan. The full weight of his actions, not just yelling at Taylor in the restaurant, but the colossal, life-altering negligence of leaving Katya all those years ago, crashed down on him. He hadn't just lost a girlfriend. He had abandoned his child. He had left them to struggle while he amassed a fortune so vast he couldn't spend it in 100 lifetimes. He had complained about his steak being cooked improperly in a restaurant where his own daughter was working to pay her way through school. The irony was so cruel, so cosmically perfect, that a harsh, barking laugh escaped his lips. The laugh morphed into a choke, then a sob. He slumped forward, his head in his hands, the glowing screen of the tablet illuminating the tears dripping onto his billion-dollar desk. The proof he had so desperately sought didn't bring him peace. It brought him damnation. The confirmation did not galvanize Gideon. It paralyzed him. For 2 days he remained a recluse in his penthouse, the file Bennett had prepared his only companion. He was adrift in an ocean of regret, the titan of industry reduced to a ghost rattling around his own opulent prison. The panoramic views of New York City, once a symbol of his conquest, now seemed to mock him, a constant reminder of the world he had chosen over the family he could have had. He saw Katya's face everywhere, in the clouds, in the patterns of the traffic, in the reflection on his darkened television screen. He saw Taylor's accusing gray eyes. He was a man who solved problems. He bought what couldn't be built, crushed what couldn't be bought. But this was a problem of the soul, and his vast resources were useless against it. Finally, on the third day, a lifetime of habit kicked in. When faced with an unsolvable problem, Gideon Shaw acted. He made a plan. His plan, as always, involved money. It was the only language he was truly fluent in. He showered, shaved, and put on one of his immaculate suits, the familiar fabric a comforting armor. He had Bennett arrange for a portfolio to be prepared, not of stocks, but of documents. A deed to a luxury condo downtown, fully furnished. The articles of incorporation for a trust fund, endowed with a sum of money that would ensure Taylor and her children, and their children's children, would never have to work again. University tuition papers, paid in full. A blank check. It was clumsy. It was soulless. It was an insult. But in his mind, it was an apology. It was restitution. It was the only way he knew how to fix what he had broken. He didn't send a car or summon her to him. In a rare act of self-awareness, he knew he had to go to her. He took a simple town car back to the brownstone in Brooklyn, the leather portfolio case sitting on his lap like a lead weight. He climbed the 4 flights of stairs, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. He knocked on the door of apartment 4B. Taylor opened it. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes. When she saw him, her expression wasn't angry or surprised, just weary. "Mr. Shaw," she said, her voice flat. She didn't invite him in. "Taylor," he said, testing the name on his tongue. It felt both foreign and deeply familiar. May I come in for a moment? I have something for you." She hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him to enter. The apartment was just as he remembered it, a small, warm oasis of a life lived. He felt even more out of place this time, the expensive leather of his portfolio case clashing with the worn fabric of her sofa. "I had my people. I looked into it," he began, his voice stiff and formal. "Everything you said was true. You are my daughter." Saying the word aloud sent a tremor through him. Taylor simply nodded, her arms crossed. "I didn't need your people to tell me that." "No, of course not," he stammered, feeling his carefully prepared script crumble. He placed the portfolio on the small coffee table and opened it, fanning out the documents like a poker hand. "I want to provide for you," he said, his voice gaining a bit of its boardroom confidence as he slipped into the familiar role of the dealmaker. This is the deed to a condominium at the new Hudson Yards development. It's yours. This establishes a trust in your name. The principal is substantial. You'll never have to worry about money again. I've also arranged to pay for any and all of your educational pursuits at any institution you choose. And this, he slid the blank check forward, is for whatever else you might need. A car, travel, anything. It's yours. He looked at her, expecting, what? Tears of gratitude? Relief? Forgiveness? He got none of it. Taylor looked at the pile of papers, at the millions of dollars represented by the ink and letterhead. She looked at the blank check. Then she looked back up at him. There was no anger in her eyes now. There was only a vast, profound disappointment that was somehow 1,000 times worse. 25 years, she said, her voice quiet but devastatingly clear. My mother scrubbed floors. She worked double shifts in a bakery, coming home covered in flour, her hands raw and chapped, just to make sure we had enough food. I started working when I was 16 to help with the rent. I've been working 2 jobs to put myself through night school so I can become a social worker. She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. We lived, we struggled, but we loved each other. Her life had value. My life has value. And you think you can walk in here now and erase all of that with a pile of money? No, that's not, Gideon began, but she cut him off. That's exactly what it is, she said, her voice rising with a passion that made him recoil. You're trying to buy my forgiveness. You're trying to acquire a clear conscience. This isn't for me. This is for you. This is you trying to balance the books on your soul. She picked up the blank check, holding it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. Do you know what I wanted when I was a little girl? She asked, her voice cracking. I wanted a father to teach me how to ride a bike. I wanted a father to be in the audience at my school play. I wanted a father to tell my mother she was beautiful and that everything was going to be okay when she got sick. She tore the check in half. Then she tore the halves into quarters. She let the pieces flutter from her hand onto the floor. You can't buy back time, Mr. Shaw, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. You can't write a check for a childhood. I don't want your money. I don't want your condo. I don't want your guilt-ridden fortune. She looked at him, her gray eyes swimming with unshed tears. I just wanted to know what kind of man could leave someone like my mother, and why he never once looked back. The rejection was absolute. It was a door slamming shut in his face, a verdict from which there was no appeal. Every defense he had, every tool he possessed, was useless. His money, the source of all his power, was worthless here. He stared at the torn pieces of the check on the floor, then at the portfolio of rejected wealth. He had come to fix a problem, and he had only succeeded in proving that he was the problem. Broken and defeated, he could only manage a single whispered word. I'm sorry. I know, Taylor said softly, but sorry doesn't build a time machine. Gideon Shaw left Taylor's apartment a diminished man. The rejection of his money was a blow more profound than any market crash or hostile takeover he had ever faced. It stripped him of his power, his identity. If he wasn't Gideon Shaw, the provider, the problem solver, the man whose checkbook could bend reality to his will, then who was he? He returned not to his penthouse, but to his empty, cavernous office. He sat in the dark, the city lights that once fueled his ego now feeling like a million judgmental eyes. Taylor's words echoed in the silence. You can't buy back time. For the first time in his adult life, Gideon was forced to confront a problem without a financial solution. He had to learn a new currency, one of patience, humility, and genuine remorse. It was a language he barely understood. He started small. He didn't call. He didn't send gifts. A week after his disastrous offering, he sent a simple, handwritten note. He hadn't written a letter by hand in decades. His script was clumsy, the words painfully awkward. Taylor, you were right about everything. I am asking for nothing. I just wanted to say that I have thought about your mother every day since we last spoke. I remembered she loved the lilacs in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Gideon. He didn't know if she'd even read it. He expected no reply, and he received none. A week later, he tried again. He went to a dusty old bookshop he'd had Bennett locate, one that specialized in Russian literature. Katya had loved Dostoevsky. He bought a worn, leather-bound copy of The Brothers Karamazov and had it delivered to her apartment with another short, simple note. She told me once this was her favorite. I never read it then. I am reading it now. Still, silence. But Gideon didn't push. He was learning the art of waiting, an alien concept for a man who demanded instant results. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't a negotiation. It was penance. Meanwhile, Taylor was struggling with her own emotional turmoil. His offer of wealth had been insulting, but his subsequent silence was confusing. She had expected him to either disappear forever or to bombard her with more aggressive attempts to buy her off. This quiet, hesitant approach was disarming. The notes were thoughtful. They were about her mother, not about him or his guilt. She found herself in a war with her own heart, a lifetime of resentment fought against a flicker of nascent curiosity. Who was this man, stripped of his power and wealth? Was there anything of the young man her mother had loved still buried beneath the decades of ruthless ambition? The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. Mr. Dubois, the manager from Aurelia, called her. He was practically weeping with apology. Mr. Shaw, he explained, had not, in fact, bought and demolished the building. Instead, he had set up a massive, anonymous endowment for the restaurant's employees, a scholarship fund for their children, a comprehensive health insurance plan that included mental health services, and a generous retirement matching program. No one knew it was from him, but Dubois had been tasked with implementing it and knew the source. He said that a company's greatest asset is its people, Dubois said, his voice full of awe. He said everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. I have never seen anything like it, Miss Petrova. He has changed. Taylor hung up the phone, stunned. This wasn't a personal gift to her. It was a systemic change, an act of atonement directed at the very culture he had embodied that fateful night. It was an action, not a payment. That evening, as she was leaving her night class, she saw a dark town car parked across the street. Gideon was standing beside it, not approaching, just waiting. He looked smaller somehow, without his usual entourage, just a man in an overcoat under a streetlight. She crossed the street, her heart beating a nervous rhythm. "This is stalking, you know," she said, her tone less harsh than she intended. "I know," he replied, his voice quiet. I wanted to ask, in person. I am trying to understand the man I was, the one your mother knew, and I can't. I don't have the memories. You do. Would you? Would you be willing to tell me about her?" He paused, his gaze dropping to the pavement. "I would be grateful if you would share a coffee with me, as people, not as a billionaire and a waitress, just a man who needs to learn and a woman who knows the story." It was the first time he had asked for something that wasn't about him. He was asking for her memories, her time, things money could not buy. He was asking for a piece of her, and by extension, a piece of Katya. Taylor looked at this powerful, broken man. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the genuine hunger to understand what he had lost. The wall of her resentment, already weakened, finally crumbled. "There's a diner 2 blocks from here," she said. "They have terrible coffee, but the pie is decent." A flicker of something, relief, gratitude, hope, crossed Gideon's face. It was the most honest emotion she had ever seen from him. "I like pie," he said softly. The diner was a relic from another era, all cracked red vinyl booths, chrome trim, and the comforting smell of coffee and frying bacon. It was Taylor's territory, a world away from the hushed temples of haute cuisine like Aurelia. For Gideon, it might as well have been a foreign country. He slid into the booth opposite her, looking profoundly out of place in his tailored suit, his movements stiff and uncertain. The waitress, a woman with a beehive hairdo and a no-nonsense demeanor, slapped 2 menus on the table. "What can I get for you folks?" she asked, eyeing Gideon's expensive watch with overt curiosity. "Just coffee, please," Taylor said. "The same," Gideon added quickly. "And a slice of the apple pie." The silence after the waitress left was thick and awkward. This wasn't a boardroom or a humble apartment. It was neutral ground, and neither of them knew the rules of engagement. Gideon fidgeted with his spoon, his usual commanding presence completely gone. "Thank you for this," he said finally. "It means more than you know." Taylor took a sip of her water. "I'm not doing it for you," she stated not unkindly. "I'm doing it for her. My mother deserves to be more than just a ghost in your past. She deserves to be known." And so, she began to talk. She didn't talk about the struggle, the poverty, or the hardship. Instead, she painted a portrait of the woman Katya Petrova was. She talked about her mother's infectious, booming laugh. She described how Katya would sing off-key Russian folk songs while she cooked, how she had a talent for fixing broken things, from a leaky faucet to a child's broken heart. She shared the story of Katya finding a wounded pigeon on their fire escape and nursing it back to health for a month, naming it Boris. Gideon listened, rapt. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer commentary. He just absorbed the details, his face a canvas of shifting emotions, regret, wonder, and a deep, aching sadness. These were the small, beautiful moments of a life he had been absent for. He wasn't just hearing about a woman he once knew. He was being introduced for the first time to the mother of his child. "She always said I got my stubbornness from my father," Taylor said with a small, sad smile. She said he was the only person she ever met who could argue with a brick wall and win. A faint ghost of a smile touched Gideon's lips. "She used to say that to me." For the first time, they were sharing a memory, albeit one from opposite ends of a lifetime. It was a tiny, fragile bridge across a vast chasm. Their pie arrived. Gideon stared at it for a moment, then picked up his fork. He took a bite, then another. He was eating pie in a cheap diner with his daughter. It was the most surreal and yet most real experience he'd had in 30 years. "She kept a photograph," Taylor said quietly, her voice drawing him back. "Just one. It was old and creased, of the two of you on the pier at Coney Island. You were both so young. You looked happy." Gideon remembered that day. The salt spray, the screech of the gulls, the taste of cheap hot dogs, the feeling that the entire world was in front of him, and that Katya was the only part of it that mattered, before the ambition had poisoned everything. "I was," he said, his voice thick. "I was happy." The conversation wasn't a flood of forgiveness. There were no dramatic declarations or tearful hugs. It was quiet, hesitant, and painful. It was two strangers, bound by blood and a shared loss, trying to read the first page of a book whose beginning had been written long ago. When they finished, Gideon insisted on paying. He left the waitress a $100 tip on a $10 bill, a gesture that was part old habit, part genuine gratitude. Outside on the sidewalk, under the cool glow of the streetlights, they stood for a moment in another awkward silence. "I have a photo album at my apartment," Taylor said, breaking it, "with pictures of her, of me, growing up. If you wanted to see them, sometime." It was a peace offering, an invitation not into her life, but into her history. Gideon's eyes shone with an emotion Taylor couldn't quite name. It was gratitude, but deeper. It was the look of a drowning man being thrown a lifeline. "I would like that very much," he said. He didn't offer her a ride in his car. He just nodded, a gesture of profound respect, and turned to walk toward his waiting vehicle. Taylor watched him go. This man who was her father. This stranger who held a piece of her story. Nothing was fixed. The years of absence couldn't be erased, and the wounds were far from healed. But as she turned to walk home, she felt a shift inside her. The burning anger had been replaced by a quiet, somber acceptance. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something far more real and far more difficult. It was a beginning. That night in the diner wasn't an end, but the start of a long, difficult road. The story of Gideon and Taylor reminds us that our actions have ripples we can't always see, and that wealth can be a poor substitute for worth. It shows that true atonement isn't about grand gestures or financial restitution, but about the quiet, humble work of listening, learning, and trying to understand the lives we've impacted. Their journey forward would be filled with awkward conversations, painful memories, and the slow, uncertain process of building something new from the wreckage of the past. It's a powerful testament to the idea that it's never too late to face the ghosts of your past, and that sometimes the most shocking thing in the world isn't a billionaire's rage, but the quiet strength of the truth. If their story moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who might appreciate it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that explore the depths of human connection. What do you think Taylor and Gideon's next conversation should be about? Let us know in the comments below.